بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So, first off, thank you all for joining us tonight. It's Valentine's Day, which means that you must really have a love for your families, because we're talking about death and dying. And the reality is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ, that every one of us is going to die. And وَإِنَّمَا تُوَفَّوْنَ أُجُورَكُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ فَمَنْ زُحْزِحَ عَنِ النَّارِ وَأُدْخِلَ الْجَنَّةَ فَقَدْ فَازَ. The reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, is that the true success is that the person attains paradise and is saved from the hellfire. And when we talk about death and we talk about dying, normally it's about how do we prepare our actions in this world with respect to our a'mal. Here we're talking about a component of that, but as it relates to what happens to us after death and what happens in particular to our wealth after death, and also with an extension of that in the event of incapacity. So the topic, inshallah, is covering three things: how to protect your family, leave a legacy, and fulfill your religious obligations. So the protect our family piece is one that is everybody understands. It's the reason we go to work, that we want to provide for our family. And we want to think about what if Allah forbid something happened to me tonight or tomorrow, what's going to happen to my family? If I'm the breadwinner, where are they going to be supported from? If I have young children, who's going to be their guardians? Right? Those are the types of questions that we want to think about. And the Prophet ﷺ says in hadith, "La aqla kat-tadbir," that there's no intelligence like good planning. And we actually see in the life of the Prophet ﷺ that he was the best planner, meticulous planner for everything. If you look at an example of the Prophet ﷺ's life, take the hijrah. He wasn't someone who just said, well, I'll just go on this journey and see what happens. Rather, every single component of that journey was laid out in detail, specifically planned, from the timing to the place to the companion to the journey to the path, everything about it. And so he manifests, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, what the hadith teaches us, that a'qil wa tawakkal, that tie your camel and then have tawakkul. And that's what we should do as Muslims, that we plan for everything within our life. We plan for, our children, we plan for their school, we plan for their education, we plan for retirement and our jobs. And the same thing happens, we should be thinking about what's going to happen to me after I pass away, and in particular what's going to happen to my family. So that's a kind of a natural thing. Whether you're Muslim or you're not Muslim, doesn't matter. The second thing we're going to think about and talk about is this concept of legacy, which is, it can be summarized in, how will people think about me after my death? How will I be remembered? Right? All of us are here. All of us are going to die. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, he makes an interesting dua. He says, وَجَعَلْ لِي لِسَانَ صِدْقٍ فِي الْآخِرِينَ. In essence, oh Allah, make people remember me in a positive light. Make my remembrance positive for the people that come after me. So this question about legacy is one about, once I'm not here, is anybody going to remember me? Is anybody going to make dua for me? What type of impact did I have in society? Was I just somebody who came, who earned a bunch of money, who worked hard, and then passed away, and that's it? Or is there something bigger? Is there a greater purpose? And so we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about this concept of fulfilling religious obligations. So this is an interesting dimension that we as Muslims have. That everybody has to pass away, everyone in this world, and everyone's wealth is going to go to somebody else. But as Muslims, we have an extra layer, that is, the Prophet ﷺ teaches us, and the Qur'an instructs us about what to do with our wealth. And it's not up to us. It's actually not up to us. And this is very different from the society we live in. It's all about, you make your own choices, you leave your wealth to whom you will. Islamic paradigm is very different. And so we'll talk about those three things, inshallah, during the course of the evening, and then we'll have time for Q&A, inshallah. So I call this the forgotten fard. Forgotten fard because this is a obligation that most people don't even realize is an obligation. Most people don't realize this is an obligation. And the Prophet ﷺ tells us, and alhamdulillah, like I have the privilege of traveling around the country and sharing this knowledge with different communities around the country. The Prophet ﷺ tells us, تَعَلَّمُوا الْفَرَائِضْ وَعَلِّمُوهُ, that learn and teach the rules of inheritance, فَإِنَّهُ نِصْفُ الْعِلْمِ, for verily it's half of all knowledge. Verily it's half of all knowledge. Now, why do you think the Prophet ﷺ says it's half of all knowledge? Like if you look through the books of hadith, you don't find that he says learn about salah, it's half of all knowledge. Or learn about wudu, or learn about hajj, or any of this. But when it comes to inheritance, he says learn and teach it, for verily it's half of all knowledge. And he says, أَوَّلُ شَيْءٍ يُنْزَعُ مِنْ أُمَّتِي, أو كما قال, that it will also be the first knowledge which is lifted from this ummah. So, and I think this manifests in the society we see today. Those of you that are here, how many of you have attended a session on this topic before? Right? So a few. So I was here last year, about a year ago, maybe slightly over a year ago. And everywhere we go, we see the same thing, which is, you know, mashallah, people have attended hundreds, thousands of khutbahs and lectures, but this is not a topic that's addressed within normal discussion. And so it's something that is, you know, in essence, specialized and also forgotten. Now, why do you think it is that the Prophet ﷺ says it's half of all knowledge? I like to be interactive. What do you think? It relates to future generations. I mean, certainly. But why would that elevate it to the rank of half of all knowledge? In essence, I mean, just think about the virtue that's associated with this. What makes it so special? Sure, it's about the future, but what else? There's no wrong answers. About equity and fairness, right? So there's a component to inheritance and estate planning in that it touches so many different relationships, right? This obligation, Allah tells you, aqimus salah. It's about you and Allah praying, right? Allah says, atu zakah. It's about you and certain poor people. The recipients of zakah are certain individuals, right? Hajj, so on and so forth. Every obligation has its impact on those that it touches. This thing has a really wide net, which is inheritance. Let me ask the question differently. How many of you have seen within your families or heard of family members that have had a dispute with respect to inheritance? So, it's funny. Only a few of you attended a lecture on the topic. The percentage was very low, but the percentage on how many have seen a dispute within your families on inheritance, everybody raises their hand, right? And we've all seen this. So perhaps that's the reason that it touches so many relationships. The other thing is, it's the only obligation that you're responsible for after your death. I'll repeat that. It's the only obligation that you are responsible for after your death. So in essence, the ulama say, part of the explanation here is that half of your knowledge relates to things you have to do while you're alive, and the other half is this field of inheritance, which you have to do after you die, but in order for that to happen, you have to put it into motion while you're alive. In order to distribute your wealth after your death, particularly in a place like America, you have to make a plan. And you have to create and utilize the tools that we have here in the US to implement that plan such that you will fulfill your religious obligation post-death. Does that make sense? And the Prophet ﷺ says in another hadith that a time will come in which people will dispute over inheritance and there won't even be anyone to be an arbitrator. And so this is actually, again, because this is even, the fiqh of it is very dense, then you layer on top of it various components of tax and state law and how do you own property and what do we do about community property and joint tenancy and all of these different things, then it becomes even more and more complex. So inshallah, what we'll do within this hour is we'll talk about what is estate planning. So the definition of terms is very important, right? Who needs an estate plan? What makes it Islamic? This is very important. You know, what makes something Islamic? We have these debates all the time about food, right, and finance. That if, for example, you stamped a halal stamp on your will, is that all it takes, or is there something more to it, right? What are the components of a plan? So what are the documents that we need to prepare as Muslims? And then we'll do questions and answers, inshallah. So that said, I'm a lawyer, and what's the first thing you do when you meet with a lawyer? Right? You guys never been to a lawyer before, huh? Nobody's dealt with lawyers before? So the first thing you do when you deal with a lawyer, right? Anyone who's in your jobs, when the lawyers put together the documents, what do? Disclaimers, right? So I just need you to agree to this, inshallah, and then we'll proceed. No. So all I'm saying in a lighthearted way is just that this is general advice, okay? So what we're doing is we're going to talk about the Islamic rules, and we're going to talk about the tools that you have to implement those rules. The specific questions that you're going to ask, I would limit those, and I would request those be about general things that apply to everybody, okay? So don't ask about your specifically unique situation and your family dynamic and such like that. We're simply talking about what are the obligations from a Muslim Islamic perspective, and what are the tools we have to implement them in the US, what are the various mechanisms by which we can implement those. The specific questions you have will be in personal interactions, and we'll have some time for that tomorrow as well, inshallah. So, first off, what's an estate? Right? If I come to you and I say, well, and it happens all the time, I introduce myself, I say, I'm an estate planning attorney. People are like, oh, that's really cool, mashallah. I'll tell my friend he has an estate, right? Because I don't have an estate. That's the notion that most people think, right? So most people think of an estate like something like this, right? That person has an estate. But in reality, what's an estate? Assets. What are assets? That's not a term we use normally. Okay? Money, stocks, property. Any real or personal property? Let's stick with her definition. Right? Okay. So the definition is incomplete. However, your estate is your assets, which is not a term we use. And so these are my assets, right? The reality is, make it simple, right? It's your stuff. It's the stuff you own, but also the stuff you owe, right? So not just when we talk about estate planning, we're not simply talking about how is my wealth going to be distributed, but in a society where people are, you know, drowning in debt, we also have to consider what is the implication of the debts that I have. As Muslims, this is really weighty. This is really important. And we'll talk about this, but the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't pray janazah over somebody who had debts outstanding. And so it's really important that we have another component. Somebody might say, well, I'm not wealthy enough to think about this stuff. Well, if you have a mortgage, if you have money that you owe to somebody, if you have, you know, anything that you owe to somebody else, that's also a reason to consider doing estate planning, right? It's a basic house. It's your stuff. It's the sort of Camry that half the people in the masjid drove here outside. Is it Tesla now? It's in the Bay, as it might be Tesla. It's not. So it's for our sisters, it's jewelry that you might have gotten on your wedding that is sitting in a box in the bank that nobody's using or on a day-to-day basis. This is all part of your estate, all of which has to be distributed. The Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرٍ. Doesn't matter if it's a lot or a little. It's not that this is something for rich people, right? There's a lot of rich people in the Bay, but this isn't just for rich people. مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرٍ نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, these are predetermined shares and they're mandatory. Mandatory for each and every one of us. So then when we think about estate planning, then what are we doing? What is it that we're doing? What are the goals? How many of you have some sort of estate plan? Right? So very low. Okay? How many of you, when you went to create an estate plan, be it online or through an attorney, what was the goal? What was your objective? What's the point? Okay. 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 Sure. Okay. So, you know, it's a great answer. And I think that's as a parent, those of us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with the privilege of being parents, right? This is the natural inclination of someone to say, look, I have to have something in place at a minimum to account for guardianship, right? Forget about wealth for a moment, right? Just guardianship, right? The court system is so complicated, convoluted, inefficient. We wouldn't want, anything to happen and such. So at least we have that plan for our families. But it's not only about death. It's not only about death. And this is the reason I asked this question. Is because, are there physicians? Any doctors here? Normally when I travel, like half the room is doctors in most massages, but in the Bay it's different, right? So people don't die suddenly. Statistically, people don't die suddenly. People get sick. People have a period of incapacity. So one of the things we're doing when we're doing estate planning is we're trying to control our property while we're alive and well. Because one type of estate plan is to just give everything you have away. If I don't own anything, well then there's no real, responsibility for me to do anything. But that's not a plan that most people would want. That's not a plan that most people would want. So take care of ourselves and our loved ones when we become disabled or pass away. So this notion of incapacity is something that we also want to account for. Is if a person is alive but unable to make healthcare or financial decisions, that's also something that estate planning is implicated in or is addressing. Now, number 3, give what we have to whom we will the way we want. Now, as Muslims, the way we want is the Sharia way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described for us. Now, a lot of times, one of the primary questions that comes up is, are we allowed to do this in America? Like, can I make a distribution that is Sharia compliant? Are the courts going to allow me to do this? And the answer is the state will respect your wishes, but you have to make a plan to do so. The state will respect your wishes. If you don't do anything, it will absolutely not be Sharia compliant. Right? So another way to say this is that everybody has an estate plan today, whether you made one or not. It's just that the state of California made it for you. Right? And that's not the Islamic way. So all of these bans, and the attempts for states to ban Sharia and all of these different things, the reality is if you create a plan, it will be respected, but you have to go through the steps to do so. And you want to do it efficiently. So has anybody dealt with probate here before? Anybody dealt with probate? Or what is probate? Let's talk about that for a moment. What's probate? Probate. Probate court. What is that? Nobody has any idea. Yes. Good. So if, for example, you want to buy my house, right? What's the normal process? Simplify it. Don't talk about mortgages and Islamic banks and this. It's just simple. You have a few dollars, you want to buy something from me. You give me the money, right? We sign some documents, and I give you title. Now, if I'm not alive, how are you going to buy that from me? That's the idea of probate. Is the court is going to come in and supervise the distribution and all of the transactions that are taking place. Okay? In theory, it's a good idea because it prevents fraud. It prevents somebody from fraudulently signing a document for something that they don't actually have control over or whatnot. But in reality, it's incredibly inefficient. And if we have the ability to select people to manage our assets after our death and distribute them the way we want, outside of the court system, that's going to be much more optimal. Because you're not paying a bunch of lawyers. right? As like an estate planning and probate attorney, we make a lot more money on the back end. Just like physicians, right? There's like preventive care, and then there's the emergency medicine, right? Where you have to go to the ER and your bills are so high. So probate is described, and some people describe it as a lawsuit against yourself. Because it's totally inefficient. There's literally no reason for it. And so when people come to an attorney to do estate planning, one of their primary motivations is to avoid probate, Muslim or non-Muslim. I think as Muslims, there's a double incentive or a double motivation for that, because we want to do something in which we don't want a judge or some third party to have to interpret what is Islamic law and why and how and who and all of this stuff, right? We want to privatize it. So to the extent we have people whom we trust, we want to assign those people to be in charge of the distribution of our assets after we pass away, right? That's the idea of probate avoidance. We'll talk more about it, but you do this primarily through the use of a trust, okay? You do this primarily through the use of a trust. So you understand that point. So then what makes a plan Islamic? So now I'm going to shift a little bit into the religious dimension of this whole conversation, right? What makes a plan Islamic? It's a question. So we said it's Islamic estate planning. What makes it Islamic? The intention. I'm going to stop on intention for a moment because that's nice. Yeah. Well, all of these are nice. But intention alone is not good enough, right? I can't just have a good niyyah that my intention is to make it Islamic and then I do something that is totally un-Islamic. But I had a good niyyah, right? It's not good enough. So you have to have the niyyah. You have to have the intention. But that intention has to be coupled with an understanding that the distribution, the provisions, go to the people whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala assigned. Now, back up a few steps. Underlying this, this principle is an understanding that wealth does not belong to us. Wealth does not belong to us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, وَلِلَّهِ مُلْكُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Right? To Allah belongs whatever's in the heavens and the earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, وَآتُوهُم مِّن مَّالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. That give them from the wealth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has entrusted to you. So in other words, the money we have, before us it belonged to somebody else. And after us it's going to go to somebody else. Right or not? You might say, no, there's money that's being created. Right? All this money in Silicon Valley wasn't there before. Right? It's cyclical. It's cyclical. It was in a different place, in a different industry, and so on and so forth, right? The wealth is going to go to somebody else after us. So in essence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put us in charge of an amount of wealth while we are alive. We can't take it with us. It's going to go to somebody else. So we're trustees of that wealth. So understanding that principle then, we have three sort of facets of financial ethics. We can't earn our money however we want. This point is clear, right? I can't go and say, hey, there's a really good opportunity, business opportunity, to start a casino down the street. Right? I'm going to make millions. We all know that's not permissible, right? Even if it's a great business opportunity, we say, no, that's haram, right? So we won't do that. The second component is how do you spend your money? So you earn your halal money. You say, okay, well, it's my money now. I can go and spend it at the casino. Everybody's going to say, man, that's obvious. You can't do that, right? So these two things we understand. We do our best to try and avoid things that are haram in earning and in investing and spending. The third is after our death, our wealth has to be distributed the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays it out in the Qur'an. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا حَضَرَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتِ إِن تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ حَقًّا عَلَى الْمُتَّقِينَ. This is Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when death approaches, you need to make a bequest or a wasiyah. Now this verse comes before the rules of inheritance were revealed. In the beginning, these rules that we find in Surah An-Nisa, they were not revealed in early Islam. Right? So this verse predated that. And we have this famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which he says it's not possible or not permissible for a believer to go 2 days without, or 2 nights, without essentially having an estate plan. Meaning you have to have a plan for what's going to happen to your wealth. Now again, in Muslim societies, right, most of the room, people are either born in Muslim countries or immigrated or are children of people who immigrated from Muslim majority countries, regardless of which country you came from, as long as there's a Muslim majority, and in fact, in many cases, even significant Muslim minorities like India, the Islamic rules are the default rules. You don't have to create any type of document for that. Is that right or not? People agree? Whether you come from Syria or from Pakistan or from India or from, it doesn't matter, right? Even secular governments where the Muslim majority, when it comes to this area of law, the Islamic rules apply. So you didn't have to make a will, you didn't have to make a trust, there's no such thing. But here you have to, because the default rules are not going to be the Islamic rules. So you actually have to take a step to do so. So then, talking about Islamic law, what is the order of distribution? What are the things, how is wealth distributed under Islamic law? What's the first thing that we have to account for? Before that, even. So, it's just burial and funeral cost, right? The most obvious of which. Burial and funeral cost have to go first. So now, this is interesting. Like I said, I get to travel around the country and visit different communities. What's the cost of dying in the Bay? How much? 7 to 10,000? 20? It's expensive to die here. Expensive to live here. Everything's more expensive. I went to Berkeley for law school, so this is like second home for me. I always love to visit, but you see the difference, right? You go to some communities, you know, the cost of Islamic burial is 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, whatever, right? You come back here and it's always generally higher. So this is, for some people, it's not an insignificant component of planning, which is to say, how is that 10,000, that 15,000, that 7,000, that 20,000 going to be accounted for? That there should be a plan, there should be something in writing, right? Some people, they wish to have their, you know, bodies sent back to their countries, and I'm not recommending this, but I'm just saying, the sunnah is to bury, you know, quickly and expedite that. But all of this stuff should be accounted for and written. That what do you want? Also, what about burial and funeral procedures and the sunnah, right? Especially when people have mixed or are converts or have family members who are not Muslim, right? You want to have in writing that I want to ensure that my body is washed and prayed upon and buried in a Muslim cemetery, right? For people that, you know, within Muslim families, often it's not something that we have to plan for, but if somebody's coming from a background in which they don't have Muslim relatives, this is critical as well. The second is debts, liabilities and debts. So, as we said before, this is something from an Islamic perspective that's really, really important. Now, debts are of different types. There are debts that you have with people, and there are debts that you have with financial institutions, right? So, for example, you have a home that is subject to a mortgage. It's possible to inherit subject to that mortgage. So you have a home, it's cost $1 million, and there's $500,000 of equity in it, and there's $500,000 of a mortgage that's still outstanding. It's possible for your heirs to inherit that home subject to that mortgage. Okay? So that's not necessarily one that immediately has to be paid back off, because they can take the equity, they can potentially refinance it, they can pay it off, they can sell it, they can do different things. But I borrow $10,000 from you. Okay? First of all, we should have that in writing. Most of the time, people don't have these things in writing. Let's assume, writing or no writing, that debt needs to be paid off before any distributions go to any of my heirs. Okay? That debt has to be paid off before any of unless the person forgives it. And this is the kind of debt that the Prophet ﷺ would not pray janazah. This is a really heavy thing, that the deeds are essentially suspended until a person accounts for their debts. So when we borrow money, whether it's from a brother, whether it's from a friend, whether it's from, you know, whomever it may be from, it should be accounted for and written in my estate plan that this needs to be paid off to this person. Same with financial debt. The ethics are that we should try to become debt-free, right? The society we live in, you know, as I said before, there's credit card debt, there's student debt, there's all kinds of different types of car, loan, home, you name it. Our, you know, intent should be to try to become debt-free. Now, there are certain debts that are forgiven on death. Right? Those are forgiven, they're forgiven, right? So that's a different story. But any debt that you owe to anybody, be it to an institution or to a individual should be accounted for in our planning. There was a question? Sure. Correct. Yeah, so same thing is, okay, so I lend, money to my brother, and we just, are working off of a handshake, and we didn't write it down. I pass away, well, that individual owes money to me, which now means it goes to my heirs, to my kids, to my family, to my parents, to my spouse. Now, if there's no writing of that transaction, there's a good chance that there's going to be a fight. There's a good chance. Is it binding? Is it forgiven? Is it go to the heirs? Well, nobody knows because it wasn't in writing. So it's another reason why, from the protection of your family, if you've lent money to someone, you also want to document it to say, hey, even if I pass, this has to go to my family because it was a loan, right? It was a qard hasana. It was a loan, no interest loan, but it should be paid back. So that's another reason why we want to account for this. The third is the wasiyah. Now, when we say the word wasiyah in fiqh, we're not talking, normally when we say wasiyah, I need to make a wasiyah. People say, come to me and say, I need to make a wasiyah. Because normally that means I need to write a will. When we're talking about wasiyah in the language of fiqh, we're talking about up to 1/3, which is what you are allowed to leave as a discretionary bequest. Okay? So you have up to 1/3, which is discretionary. The rest of it is mandatory. The rest of it is mandatory. So up to 1/3. Now, this is something that I think we are grossly underutilizing within our communities. Why do I say that? Because this is how nonprofits generally function, is that people, upon their death, they leave bequests in the order of some percentage of their estate to build an endowment to fund the nonprofit, so that that endowment is then invested in perpetuity. The money goes to, fund the operations of the institution. I'll give you an example. There was a guy, his name was John Harvard. Okay? John Harvard was a young religious immigrant to the United States in the year 1638. Okay? Or he passes away, actually, in the year 1638. Passes away in the year 1638. He's 30 years old. He leaves a will, and he says, I want to leave half of my wealth to build a library for a school that at the time did not have a name in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Anybody know where this is going? Everybody knows where this is going, right? He funds that as the endowment for Harvard University. Half his wealth. Young, religious immigrant, 30 years old, dies early. And he leaves this library. They end up naming the university after him. What's the size of the endowment at Harvard University today? Anybody have an idea? Close to $1 billion. It's higher. What do you think? 20, 30, even higher. Over $40 billion. Okay? Is the endowment from Harvard University today. And a lot of universities. You go to Stanford down the street. You go to these elite universities. You go to hospitals. You go to museums. You go to synagogues and churches. They have sizable endowments. Obviously, not in the range, in the $40 billion range. But the point I'm trying to say is that within our community, we have a lot of John Harvards as well. A lot of wealthy young immigrants, or older immigrants for that matter. Or forget about immigrants, just people that have the opportunity to leave bequests. Now, if your kids are independent, right? So if we're speaking to the older generation of uncles and aunties, if your kids are well-to-do already, they're financially stable, well, this is a perfect opportunity to leave what's known as a sadaqah jariyah, right? To utilize this as a sadaqah jariyah. The Prophet ﷺ says that إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنَ آدَمْ انْقَطَعَ عَمَلُهُ إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ, that when the son of Adam passes away, his deeds are finished, except for three things. صَدَقَةٌ جَارِيَةٌ, that the charity that continues in perpetuity, أَوْ عِلْمٌ يَنْتَفَعُ بِهِ, or a knowledge that benefits other people, أو ولد صالح يدعو له, or a righteous child that makes dua for you. Those are the only three things that are going to continue to benefit a person after they die. So we can utilize this wasiyah to do that. And I encourage people to do so. Now, in addition, this wasiyah can be used to fulfill unfulfilled religious obligations. Person missed Hajj, for example. So for example, they have the ability to go for Hajj, they're planning to do so, and they should have in their plan that I have the intention to go for Hajj in 2 years. If something happens to me in the interim, I would like to allot this money to somebody to go for Hajj on my behalf, because it was mandatory. Now, you might have a plan that I want to coordinate so that my kids have some, something taken care of them and so on and so forth, which is fine, inshallah, but you want to have that written down. I missed this in my life, these obligations. I have zakat that perhaps I didn't pay completely or optimally. You want to make sure that a portion of your wasiyah goes to offset those outstanding obligations. Only up to 1/3. So sometimes people come and say, look, I want to leave 100% to charity. They'll come to me and say, I would love this masjid. MashaAllah, it's amazing. I want to give all my wealth to the masjid. Right? Can't do it. So my kids are good. Can't do it. And in fact, there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anh, he said to the Prophet ﷺ, I would like to leave my wealth 100% to charity. This is a famous hadith. He says, you can't. He says, fine, half. He says, half is too much. He says, how about 1/3? He says, 1/3, فَالثُّلُثُ وَالثُّلُثُ كَثِيرٌ. Fine, 1/3, and even 1/3 is a lot. Now, interesting, Sa'ad radiallahu anh is making this request potentially on his deathbed. He was sick and he wanted to make this request on his deathbed. Sa'ad doesn't die after making this hadith, after this hadith. Anybody know where Sa'ad radiallahu anh is buried? Anybody know? China. He's one of the last Sahaba he has a very long life, and he's buried in China years after this hadith is narrated. So the reason I mention this is because sometimes people say, especially within certain cultures, there's this notion that if you talk about dying, you're going to die, right? So it's just better not to talk about it. So if we talk about it, then we might die. So he talks about it. He raises this point because he's trying to make that bequest. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses him with a very long life, such that he's buried one of the farthest Sahaba in the land of China. So don't think that if I make an estate plan that I'm just, signing away my life. No, you're making a plan because you're supposed to. And everything is written of when a person passes away. Yes? Good question. Good. Great question. The wasiyah can be for institutions, as I mentioned. It can also be for somebody who is not an heir. So the hadith mentions, La wasiyyata li warith, that there is no wasiyah for a warith. Meaning, we're going to talk, the next slide is about who gets what. In the mandatory, in the non-discretionary share, I can't say that I would like to enhance the share of one of my daughter or my wife or my son, etc., through this vehicle of the wasiyah. Right? The ulama say no, because the hadith is explicit. That you can do whatever you want with it. You can give it to a grandchild, you can give it to a niece or a nephew or an institution or an organization or whomever, as long as they're not a sharia warith. We're going to get to that. In certain cases they might be, in certain cases they won't be. It depends on the relationships and the people that are alive. Yeah. Good. Debts and obligations refers to debts that you owe to people, category 2. If you would like to leave a wasiyah, or you are trying to fulfill obligations that you may have missed in your lifetime, meaning these are debts to Allah, those come out of the wasiyah share. Because you can't violate the rights of individuals, the haqq of your heirs. Like this person can't say, well, I never did it, so I'm just going to give all my wealth when I die. Like that's not how it works. This is not intended to be like, sort of a dollar for dollar credit. This is to make up for things that you missed. And so the cap on these unfulfilled obligations is the third. Okay? So what I want to do is look at Surah An-Nisa. The primary, the reason, or one of the beauties of this is that there aren't that many differences among the madhahib when it comes to Islamic inheritance, because there are explicit texts that come from the Qur'an. And they are largely ayah number 11, number 12, and 176 of Surah An-Nisa. 3 ayat are going to constitute the crux of Islamic inheritance law. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُوصِيكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي أَوْلَادِكُمْ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you a wasiyah with respect to your children. Allah is giving you a wasiyah. Right? An admonition here. لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. That a male child gets double the share of a female child. This already raises many alarm bells. That, what are we talking about here? Why is this? Why is this verse here? It's because males are better than females, right? Right? No? So what's the reason? Right? Right. Yes. Same answer? Correct. So both answers are correct. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the financial burden is on the male. Right? Regardless of how society is structured, the religious obligation is on the male. الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. Right? Due to the nature of the spending obligation, that the male is responsible for each of the female relatives that he has that are closest. In other words, mother, sisters, daughters, wife, all of those are going to be the responsibility of the closest male heir. Now, the wife or the daughter also inherits from multiple relationships as well. Okay? So there's also going to be multiple levels of inheritance that are coming. On top of that, a person might say, well, it's still not fair. My daughter is, my son makes a lot of money, my daughter doesn't make a lot of money. Or they make the same amount of money. I want to make this fair. So the rule doesn't change. It's an express Quranic injunction. If you would like to take care of your daughters, to take care of your spouse, to make sure that people are well accounted for, which we all should do, of course. That's a natural tendency and something we want to protect our families. These rules do not apply while you're alive. So, you have a son and a daughter, you want to give them money while you're alive? Does it need to be at a 2-to-1 ratio? Should it be at a 2-to-1 ratio? No, it should not. In fact, if you'd like to give more to your daughter to protect her, and to kind of enhance and to ensure that she has enough, you can do that as well. So these rules are upon death. A lot of times people will, get confused and think that these rules apply during life. They do not apply during life. They apply on death. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِن كُنَّ نِسَاءً فَوْقَ اثْنَتَيْنِ فَلَهُنَّ ثُلُثَا مَا تَرَكْ وَإِن كَانَتْ وَاحِدَةً فَلَهَا النِّصْفُ. That the largest share actually goes to a daughter. The largest share that's mentioned, the two largest shares, they are for a daughter. If a person has 2 or more daughters and no sons, those daughters are going to take 2/3 of the estate. If there's only one daughter, she gets half of everything. Okay? Doesn't matter if we're talking about a male or a female. The person who passes away. These rules apply for husband and for wife. Okay? Now, the next category in the verse is parents. Parents under state law, do they inherit? Say you have kids. Do your parents get anything? Nope. Tough, right? Parents go to nursing home, and kids are going to get what they need. It doesn't matter. This is the ethic. This is the way the society functions here. Now, Islamic ethics with respect to parents are such that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attaches obedience to Allah and birrul walidain. That extends post-death in Islam. Meaning, your parents, وَلِأَبَوَيْهِ لِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا السُّدُسُ مِمَّا تَرَكَ إِنْ كَانَ لَهُ وَلَدٍ. That if you have a child, your parents, and they're alive, they each get 1/6 of your wealth. Now, what if you said, well, my parents don't care? Okay, they don't have to care. They can give it to your kids, but it's their haqq, it's their entitlement. The share is written by Allah. Oftentimes, as a practical matter, they'll say, look, we're good, we don't need it, give it to the kids, right? But it's their haqq, it's their entitlement. You can't make that decision for them. You can't say, hey, my kids need it more. ولأبويه لكل واحد منهما السدس مما ترك إن كان له ولد فإن لم يكن له ولد وورثه أبواه فلأمه الثلث. If you don't have children, then the mother gets a third. Very large share, right? This is the right of the mother. فإن كان له إخوة فلأمه السدس. But if you had more than 2 siblings, then the mom's share drops back down to a sixth. Look at the complexity, subhanAllah. This is all in the Qur'an. I mean, there's no religious scripture that has this type of depth. People talk about the miracle of the Qur'an. They look at the science. They look at the eloquence. They look at the, the predictions. But this is a whole nother level. If you've studied law and you look at a law rule book or a statute on inheritance, this reads like a statute. And it's held the course of time, the course of generations, societies, 1,400 years. And the rules are still applicable today. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِن كَانَ مِن بَعْدِ وَصِيَّةٍ يُوصِي بِهَا أَوْ دَيْنٍ. After the wasiyah, that 1/3 and the debts are paid. So all of these things, let's say you have $100, you decided you owe $10 to somebody. So first, or let's say it costs $10 to die, you're down to 90. It costs $10 you owe to Ahmed, so that also comes out, that's 80. And now you're going to leave a third. I made the math hard on myself. so let's make it 25%. Okay, so you leave 25% to the masjid. So now you're down to 60. The 60 gets distributed according to these rules. Now you're going to ask, well, what about joint property? We're going to get there, right? What about joint property? This should be the first question that comes to mind. Husband and wife, both on the deed. What now? Who owns what? So we'll come there. Now, usually people say these rules are cool. They're great, mashallah, they're fascinating. But my situation is unique. Like my family has this my family's totally different, right? People are thinking that in their head. I get it all the time, right? We don't have a relationship, someone's child and parent relationship is broken, somebody's brother and sister relationship is broken, you name it, right? Someone thinks that these rules are great, but I know that there should be a little bit different taqsim, the distribution should be slightly different in my family. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses that. He says, آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا. So, let me ask this question. If you have a 2-year-old son, you have a 2-year-old son, and you have an 80-year-old father, and you're dying, who deserves your wealth more? The son. Why? Why? You picked the son. You got to tell me an explanation. He has a whole life in front of him. Everybody agree? Anybody disagree? Well, the mother wasn't even part of the calculation in this. so, you don't know who's going to have a longer life. What about the father who took care of you your whole life, who raised you? What type of indebtedness do we have to the father? Right? Isn't it a fair argument for the father? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, you don't know the answer. آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا. You don't know the answer. You don't know who's more deserving. You don't know what that child would do with the wealth. Would they squander it? Would they spend it wisely? You have a sense of indebtedness to the father. These are answers you can't make. Like the morality, the rationality of every decision is limited. Our understanding of what we think is good, right, might not be good. And so Allah says, فَرِيضَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ. These rules are mandatory from Allah. And in case you think you have a better, sort of system, the end of the ayah, we always gloss over the end of the ayahs, right? We don't really pay attention to them. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. Look at the precision. Allah is most knowledgeable and most wise. He's like preempting your thoughts. That you hear this verse, you say, oh, this is amazing, but. Right? He says, just eliminate the but what? Inna Allah kana aliman hakima. Okay? Verse number 11. Amazing. Now, this should be 12 actually. Verse number 12, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, now we're talking about spouses. وَلَكُمْ نِصْفُ مَا تَرَكَ أَزْوَاجُكُمْ إِن لَّمْ يَكُن لَّهُنَّ وَلَدٌ. فإن لم يك فإن ولكم نصف ما ترك أزواجكم إن لم يكن لهن ولد فإن كان لهن ولد فلكم الربع مما تركن من بعد وصية يوصين بها أو دين. If a person passes away, if a married woman passes away, what does the husband get? A quarter if there are children, and half if there are no children, right? وَلَهُنَّ الرُّبُعُ مِمَّا تَرَكْتُمْ إِن لَّمْ يَكُن لَّكُمْ وَلَدٌ فَإِن كَانَ لَكُمْ وَلَدٌ فَلَهُنَّ الثُّمُنُ مِمَّا تَرَكْتُمْ مِن بَعْدِ وَصِيَّةٍ تُوصُونَ بِهَا أَوْ دَيْنٍ. Now, if the husband passes away, what does the wife get? It's on the board, right? An eighth if he has children, or a quarter if he doesn't have children. Okay? So these rules are laid out. These are the shares that the spouse is going to get. Now, again, a person is going to say, well, how is an eighth enough for a spouse today? Is an eighth enough? And it's a good question. It's a good question. So, that's the share on death. If I get this all the time, an eighth is not enough. I have to give my wife more. Sure, Bismillah, you can give her anything. Why don't you transfer your house to her while you're alive? I don't love her that much, right? You know? So understand that these rules are on death. What you do while you are alive as a hiba is totally allowed. Totally allowed. Now understand this point. Again, there are consequences to gifting and such, and we have to address the question of joint tenancy and community property. Right? That's critical. Right now we're doing the Islamic rules, then we'll come to how do we integrate these with state law. Yes, there was a question. So I want to come to that point after. Let me finish the doctrinal rules, right? The Quranic rules with respect to who gets what. Because this question of who gets what cannot be answered until, the fractions are only useful if we know what we're dividing. I have $100 in a joint bank account. Is that $100 mine, or is it 50-50? Are we cutting from 50 or are we cutting from 100? That's a question that's going to come, right? So it's a very important question. I'm sure everybody has that question. Yeah, so the principle there is that you can't do dhulm when you're doing the lifetime distributions. So if you're gifting while you're alive, you can't do so in a way that is unfair. If your intent is to deprive somebody of future inheritance and such, you're going to be sinful with Allah. Right? That's between a person and Allah. The distribution rules don't apply. So if a person does something, right? If a person conditions behaviors while they're alive, which is to say, if you, my son, do this, follow my rules, I will give you this, and son number 2 doesn't do that, well then that's fine, right? There was some rules, there's some grounding, there's some basis for, being unfair, being disproportionate, that's okay, right? As I said before also, if the intent is to help somebody who needs help, one of your child needs help, the other one doesn't need help, so you pay for one, you don't pay for the other, that's all based on intent here. If the intent is to deprive, then yes, that's unfair. These rules don't apply, however. Now, the second part of this verse is about a kalala. What's a kalala? Anybody know? No? Kalala is somebody who has neither ascendants nor descendants. Meaning the parents are not alive, their children are not alive. Up and down. Parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren. Okay? So there's no lineal descendants or ascendants. Okay? So that's part of this verse. Also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنْ كَانَ رَجُلٌ يُورَثُ كَلَالَةً أَوْ إِمْرَأَةٌ وَلَهُ أَخٌ أَوْ أُخْتٌ فَلِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا السُّدُسُ. In this particular scenario, when we're talking about maternal half-siblings, it's getting complicated, but maternal half-siblings, brothers and sisters inherit in equal shares, not 2-to-1 anymore. Why is that? The reality is, that's because Allah said it's like that. It just goes to sort of there's a wisdom behind everything, whether we understand it or not. And the kalala I'm going to gloss over, but the kalala has rules that are mentioned here. وإن كان رجل يورث كلالة أو امرأة وله أخ أو أخت فلكل واحد منهما السدس فإن كانوا أكثر من ذلك فهم شركاء في الثلث من بعد وصية يوصى بها أو دين غير مضار وصية من الله والله عليم حليم. So Allah says this is a wasiyah from Allah, and Wallahu alimun halim. Allah is most knowledgeable and forbearing. Again, it's His kindness that He is giving us these rules. Okay, so we're coming up on Salah. What I want to do is, I want to test you guys now, because everybody should be an expert in Islamic inheritance, right? You comfortable with the rules now? So let's take a scenario, and we'll pick up. I think we'll pick up after Salah with what do we do from a state law perspective? Where do we go from here after we learn the rules? What do we do? Let's take an example: Ahmed and Sarah. Okay, Ahmed and Sarah. They've got 3 beautiful children, Umar, Sumayya, and Khadija, and Sarah has her mother, Aisha. Okay? Beautiful family, mashallah. Right? So Sarah passes away in a tragic accident. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Okay? You're cutting me off, huh? 5 minutes, okay. Can we pick up after Salah? We can definitely continue after Salah. Definitely. All right, awesome. Great. So, Sarah passes away. Who gets what? Who gets what? Let's go one by one. Okay? What does Aisha get? Aisha. 1/6. 1/6. Okay? Mother gets 1/6. Okay? What does Ahmed get? 1/4. Good. 1/4. What do the kids get? Of the remainder. So you take 1/6, you add 1/8, you take the remainder, and that's what the kids are going to get. The husband and the parent are going to be concurrent. They're what's known as dhawil fara'id, and the children are known as asaba in this category. So we take 1/6 and 1/8, we take that out. We take the remainder, that becomes asaba, that goes to the children at a 2-to-1 ratio. Okay? Now, let's assume Sarah does not have a, actually, so here's the breakdown under Islamic Inheritance Law. Okay? That's the fraction. So a 4th, a 6, 7/48, 7/48, 7/24. Okay? What does Ahmed get in the absence of an estate plan? $100%. 100%. Spouse. It's going to get 100%. Correct. So we'll pause for that. So let's do this. Let's pick this slide up after Salah, inshallah. And then we'll talk about the shares for each. And we'll talk about the will and the trust and the documents that we need to do in order to implement and create a plan that is religiously compliant, inshallah. We'll take about 20 minutes to 30 minutes to close after Salah. Is that okay for everybody? Yes. Yes.
If somebody is knowledgeable completely about the Sharia requirement,
Yes.
why we cannot achieve the same result by doing it simple will rather than going, what's the difference between will and trust?
So will and trust is after Isha. You got to stick around for that. It's a great question. The will and trust distinction is one that is very important for Muslims. The shortest answer is because it's not going to change the way property is owned. So I'd like you to stick around after Isha because that's actually the crux of what I want to talk about. Is these fractions won't get implemented in a will, generally speaking. No matter, even if you put these fractions in a will, they're not gonna apply because of the way that property is owned between a husband and wife, generally speaking. Okay? If there's joint names on accounts and such, the will not control. That's why. So we'll come to that after Salah, inshallah. Yes. Yes. Oh, you're not going to be able to make it? Okay. Oh, sorry. So you can, inshallah, I think this is being recorded. So you can were talking about the shares and the distribution under Islamic law if Sarah passed away. So we said these would be the shares, yes. Yeah. So you have $10. So correct. So 25% goes to Ahmed, 16.67% goes to Ahmed. I'm sorry, Aisha. Right. So that's how the percentages work. So the sum has to add up to 1, which is, when you study, actually interesting, the fiqh, like part of the fiqh textbooks, they teach how to like do fractions and stuff as well. So, and not only that, but subhanAllah, algebra by itself, who's the founder of algebra? Khwarizmi is, if you look at his book, actually what he's doing in part of the book is solving inheritance problems. So you talk about the legacy of Islam and the scholars, part of what he's doing and why he's coming up with this is to solve these complicated questions. So actually that's his contribution to human society is algebra, in large part because how do you do this math without it, without the fractions, right? Like with something we take for granted. So now we're at this point, we're at this juncture where we're raising this question of, well, what about Ahmed and what does he get under state law? So now we address this question that I think is on everybody's mind is what happens? Now, Sada passes away, Ahmed takes 100% of the community property. So what is community property? Now we're outside the realm of Islamic law. We're in the realm of California, right? We're in the realm of about 11 or 13 states, something like this, that have, or 9 states, I don't remember. The western part of the U.S. has community property. So that includes Arizona, Texas, even though that's the south, California, and so on and so forth. What is community property? Somebody summarize it for me. Somebody has to know what community property is. Anybody? Who's the like me and you, or like what's husband and wife? Okay, husband and wife own property in these states. The default assumption is community property. What that means is regardless of which spouse earns what, the presumed ownership is 50-50. Okay, so let's repeat that. Wife is a neurosurgeon. Husband is a stay-at-home dad. We invert the analogy in most cases, right? Wife is a neurosurgeon, husband is a stay-at-home dad. She earns $1 million, he earns 0. Who owns what? 50-50. 50-50. Now, is that Islamic? No. In its core, right? Like the Islamic sort of principle of wealth, the reason I give this example is because that money that wife earned under Islamic law is her money. It's her money, right? And so what's interesting, and the reason I raise this point is because people talk a lot about the unfairness of the system, of Islamic law's system of giving less to women. Whereas in certain cases, the privilege of women in Islam is much higher. So that wife that earned $1 million and that husband, let's say that he's stay at home, let's take him a step further and say he's like a deadbeat, he doesn't do anything, right? He still owns 50% of her wealth, okay? Now, that comes in the case of death or divorce. These are the 2 times where it matters, death or divorce, okay? Even if she has a separate bank account. So absent some prenup, if she doesn't have a prenup, that's assumed 50-50. So now let's start from that assumption, which is there's a husband and a wife. They're both working, or one of them is working. Now, we can't answer questions of Islamic law and distributions until we decide this question of who owns what. So, when a couple comes to do estate planning, it's critical that they decide who owns what. Because the starting point is it's 50-50. The state has decided for you that it's 50-50. Okay? So sometimes the sisters don't even realize that they're a lot wealthier than they are in actuality. Right? They have a husband who's working. The wife is taking care of the family. She actually owns 50% of everything the husband has, per state law. Now, you might say, well, I don't believe in that. Well, if you don't believe in that, then you have to come up with a post-nuptial agreement or a property agreement, because the default law of the state is that it's 50-50. Now, battery is running low. Okay, let's plug that in. So now, is it Islamic? It can be, right? Either as an adoption of the state law, or the husband and wife agree, like in the context of somewhat like a hibah, that everything they own, let's see if you can plug that in for me, thank you, is going to be 50-50, okay? So that's the first piece, is community property. The second part of that is we have what's known as a right of survivorship. So how many people own property, a home, here in the Bay? How many people own a home? How many people have husband and wife on there? Okay? So what happens to that property, and this is, Uncle, this is your question. What happens to that property if you write a will with Islamic distribution provisions and you pass away? What happens? No. So it goes 100% to the spouse. And so this is the point here. This is why the will doesn't work. Because the contract, meaning the way that you own your property, which is husband and wife with the right of survivorship, the way that it's titled, is going to supersede what you put in a will. So you have a home that is jointly titled. You have a bank, I'm going to give most people's common accounts. They have a home, they have a bank account, it might be jointly titled. You have a retirement account, it has some beneficiaries named on it, usually the spouse, right? And maybe some investment accounts, right? That constitutes the bulk of most people's investments. You have a really nice Islamic will. Went to a lawyer, paid him a bunch of money, put all these fractions in. What happens once the one spouse passes away? It goes 100% to the surviving spouse, irrespective of what's written in the will. This is a really key point. Now, this is what happens in this example. You might say, well, Sarah says, everything goes to my husband. That's not a bad result, right? That's not a bad result. Because look at the guy. He's got a kufi, he's got a beard, he's a nice guy, right? They both pass. We'll come to the both. Yeah, we'll get there. But let's say the one spouse example, right? The guy looks like a good, nice guy. My spouse will handle everything, right? Most people are comfortable with that result. So what happens a couple months later? Right? He gets bored, he gets lonely, so he now gets married again. He gets married again to Hajar, who has 2 kids from a different husband. Okay? So now, what I'm trying to say here is, this is not an uncommon scenario. This is statistically not an uncommon scenario. So if somebody wants to ensure that their wealth gets distributed to their heirs, because it's their religious obligation to do so, the assumption, or just leaving it to the spouse and saying hopefully things will work themselves out, is not really a plan. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it works, don't get me wrong. Many times it works. But it's not a plan, right? So the plan should be that I want to ensure that my distributions take place the way they should, according to Sharia. Because what happens now if Ahmed, who didn't learn his lesson the first time, now passes away? Now what? Then it gets complicated. There you go. That's the gist of it. Everything doesn't go to Hajj. The state's not that unfair, but a large portion, the community, the separate property, the community property. So the answer is she's going to get all of the community, their new community, and then a third of his separate property. So there's community property and there's separate property. So this gets complicated. To your point, his kids are going to get some, right? His kids are going to get some. Who's going to get nothing? Sarah's mom, right? His former mother-in-law. His former mother-in-law gets 0, okay? That's what most people would say, right? But that's un-Islamic, right? That It's his former mother-in-law. Does he care? He might not care. Well, that was an obligation on the wife who passed away to make sure her mom got her share. It was her responsibility, right? And so this is why this stuff becomes very complicated and very important to write out. Now, grandmother Aisha gets nothing, right? So this takes us to the point of property ownership. This takes us to the point of property ownership, and what are the tools by which we can create an estate plan that fulfills our religious obligations and also stays out of the probate court. Okay? So basically there are 4 documents. There's 4 types of documents when you think about estate planning. The first is a will. Okay? Everybody's heard of a will. Everybody's heard of a will. Okay? And despite hearing of it, most people actually don't have one. No, I'm serious. Most people don't have one. We get a lot of calls before Hajj. I'm going for Hajj. I need a will. Why does somebody need a will before Hajj? I mean, what makes Hajj any different than me driving home today or flying back to Phoenix tomorrow? Nothing, right? I mean, alhamdulillah, Hajj is in large part very safe, right? Statistically, there's millions of people come and millions of people go back home, right? I don't know that there's any statistical probability of Hajj being a more natural disaster scenario than anything else we're doing in life. Which means, the point I'm trying, it's good. Don't not make a will when you go for Hajj now. Go ahead and do it. But we should do it at all times. Everybody knows, especially like I said, if you have minor children, if you have kids, if nothing else, if the property stuff doesn't matter to you, then the guardianship stuff should, right? Yeah. Guardianship happens in the will, yeah. Regardless of, even if you make a trust, you have to have a will, because guardianship for kids happens inside of a will. Now, this is an important question. Sometimes you have 2 sets of family members on both sides who are well-intentioned who start to fight after the scenario where 2 spouses pass away. Allah protect our families. So it's good to pick guardians, because you might have my family, you might have my wife's family. They both might want guardianship of their children, well-intentioned, right? That in and of itself can also lead to dispute. Right? So we get to pick this out. Now there's some guidance with respect to Islamic law on who's entitled, but this is the thing that you get to know your family and pick and understand. Some relatives are overseas, some relatives are here, who's healthy, who's this, who's going to raise them as good Muslims. These are the kinds of questions that we think of when we're thinking about guardianship. I wouldn't call them rules the way that we have rules for inheritance. We have guidance. But again, that guidance, you know your family, right? So if there's somebody who has priority, relative priority, but they're not good Muslims, or they're too elderly, or so on and so forth. So location, all of these things come into factor. So basically, what you pick, the courts are going to respect, absent some really outstanding problem with the person. The person should be in the U.S. because what good does it do to name somebody overseas if they can't get here? Correct. Not only that, but what good does it do? They can't get here, right? It doesn't have to be, yeah. So my point is, you look at your scenario and your surroundings and your situation, and you decide this person is best suited to be the guardian of my child. It's a huge amana, right? And so you make that decision, and you put it in the will. Yeah. Sure. Good. That's a great question. Can I name my family overseas? We get it all the time. At a minimum, name a temporary guardian in the U.S. Name somebody, because, again, Allah forbid something happens to me, even if the family is overseas and they're able to come and they have the right paperwork and such, because you're not going to get a visa just off of the passing. But let's assume they have, the ability to travel freely. Even then, there's a time gap in which we don't want the state to take custody of a child, right? That's obviously very suboptimal. So name a temporary person who's a close friend, neighbor, masjid, somebody, right? If you don't have relatives, who can be responsible at least on a temporary basis until such and such relative gets here or they're taken there. Yes. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to come to that. Okay. So what does a will do? A will names guardians, says what happens to my stuff that is separate. So if the house and the bank accounts and the retirement accounts are not jointly owned, the will can control. So if you have a home by yourself and there's no joint ownership, then yes, the will work. Okay? But if there's joint ownership of stuff, the will doesn't work. It goes to the survivor, generally. Okay? The other problem with the will is that it has to go through probate court. You have to take the will, submit it to the court. They have to verify that it's legit, and then they'll follow through with the implementation. Okay? So it's better than nothing, for sure, absolutely, but it's not necessarily the best result. And we'll talk more about it. Power of attorney is for incapacity. As we said before, people get incapacitated. So instead of, the will only kicks in on death. But what if somebody is in a coma? What if somebody's sick? What if somebody can't make financial decisions or healthcare decisions? These advanced directives and powers of attorney are very important. Yes? I'm going to come to that. Yeah, let me come to beneficiaries and stuff when we finish this slide. Let's talk for a moment about healthcare directives, though. I don't want to take too much time on this, but I do want to address it. How many people have seen a dispute relating to end-of-life care? Meaning, should you pull the plug, don't pull the plug, what happens? Seen it? Right? It can be messy. It can be really emotional. It's a time for dua, and instead people are fighting. Family members come into play, sometimes different family members. It's really important. I think it's really critical that we should have healthcare directives. I think Muslims, by and large, don't have them. If nothing else, designate a person who is responsible for making decisions. Make one person responsible. Because even within a family, everybody's heard of Terry Schiavo case, right? Terry Schiavo, it's a few years old case from Florida. It went all the way to Supreme Court, where the woman was in a coma. There's a dispute between her parents and her husband about pulling the plug or not. Case goes on for years. So many courts, so many lawyers. Imagine probably thousands, millions of dollars in legal fees probably eaten up in this. There's a case here in Oakland, actually, a famous case of a 15-year-old girl last year on the definition of death. Jahi McMath. Heard of this case before? So she's a young girl, goes in for a routine tonsillectomy, has some complications, passes away. Declared brain dead by the doctors. Parents, her mother, objects on the grounds of religious basis, that brain death is not real death. And it's a really, it's fascinating, but it's a very messy case. She ends up getting transported to New Jersey through like a GoFundMe campaign, which is one state where you can be brain dead and not actually dead, not declared dead. And the basis for that is Orthodox Jews have they lobbied there to allow, as long as there's a heartbeat, there's life. Okay, so she stays for years in this situation where the doctors have already declared her brain dead. There's a big dispute. They bring the head of Stanford to be an expert in this case. Anyways, the point of what I'm trying to say here is not, you can read that case, it's very fascinating. And it's right out of Oakland from 2000. She passed away last year, so it's probably 2014 and on, is like a 5-year case. The point is we need to pick healthcare, somebody in charge, some family member to be responsible. They can consult with the rest of the family members. They can consult with the doctors. They can consult with the ulama, but pick one person. This is my point that I think is really important. Now, the last thing is a trust. So does anybody have a trust? Does anybody know what a trust is? Somebody tell me. Yes. 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 So I like to simplify things. Think of it like a bucket. Put all your stuff inside the bucket. Okay? Put everything you own inside the bucket. Your home, your bank accounts, okay? The beneficiaries of your retirement accounts, any life insurance policies, any investment accounts, life insurance we can talk about in the Q&A separately. But if you have it, you can have everything flow into the trust. Okay? Now, you manage the trust while you're alive, you and your wife, you and your husband, as the trustees. Upon your death, the assets in the trust never go to probate because the trust itself never dies. The trust never dies, so we never have to go to probate court. Inside of this trust, we can say that my half of the assets in the trust should be distributed to my Islamic heirs. So assume we have 50-50 ownership of our assets as our starting point, right? I got a $100 bank account with my wife and I, both of us, our names are on that account. If we don't have a trust, we just do a will, the assumption is $100 goes to my wife. It's up to her whether she ends up distributing it the way we're supposed to or not. That's kind of an amana. We do a trust, we say it's 50, there's $100 in that joint bank account, and it turns, this was another question is, well, what about, there's 100 today, what if tomorrow there's 200 or there's 50? Well, regardless, we're going to say whatever's in this account, it's 50-50, and upon my death, I want 50% of it to be distributed per the Sharia. And I'm naming my wife, my brother, my son, my father, in that order, whatever, to be the trustees. And it's their job now to distribute the assets per our instructions, and they're legally bound to do so. This is the difference. It's not just an amana, it's not just a hope, but they're legally bound to manage our assets for the benefit of the beneficiaries. So for example, I have 3 kids, alhamdulillah, they're minors, and somebody has to manage that wealth until there's a certain age for them. We can pick the age. It can be 18, it can be 21, it can be 25. Islamically, there's a concept of rushd. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحِ وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى. That tests the orphan. In other words, don't squander wealth. Don't give, it's never a good idea to give some 18-year-old a bunch of money. So just as we're concerned about planning, we're also concerned about work ethic. We're also concerned about what type of children are we going to be raising if they get a bunch of money at 18. That's probably suboptimal, right? Some kids are very mature, but in a lot of cases they're not. So this age of rushd is something where we can determine inside of the trust what age they get it and what rules the trustee will have in terms of distributing wealth. Okay? So, to summarize back, we said the will names guardians for children, names a personal representative, and dictates who gets separate property. Separate property. The cons are that it has to go still through probate, which in California in particular, there's a lot of fees for probate. There's statutory fees, so lawyers can take a percentage. Very expensive. It's also very lucrative. So you want to avoid it, right? There's literally no reason to do that. Doesn't control joint assets or assets that have beneficiary designations. I have a beneficiary as my spouse on my 401k. I make this really nice Islamic will, put all the fractions in. Doesn't mean anything. It's 100% to spouse, right? Sometimes people have an old beneficiary, they get married, they don't even update it. They have kids, they don't update it, etc. Whatever's on that document, in fact, even if a person gets divorced and they have an ex-spouse on the document, right? Then it goes to court over a dispute because they never updated their documents. We've had these types of cases as well, where people don't update their beneficiaries. Those beneficiaries control over anything else you do, unless you do a trust and you change the beneficiary to the trust. Not a lot of tax planning opportunity. I put typical cost at $500. It might be more, it might be less. You have opportunities to do it yourself. In fact, we have created an opportunity for you to do a free will. My intention in doing so is that it's better than nothing. And most people don't have one. And so at least if you do nothing else when you leave here, go ahead and create a will. Right? Create your will, and then you might say, okay, well, I want to set up a trust, but I'm not ready, or it's too expensive, or I want to get there at some point. At least make sure you have a will. Right? It's not the best scenario, it's not the best solution, but we've made it totally free. Okay? There's no catch here. You can text this number. The easiest way to do this is you can text the word masjid to this number, 444999. Okay? You text that, it's going to ask you 2 questions, it's going to send you a link to create a free will. There's no catch. It's going to calculate your shares under Islamic law, who gets what, and you get to name your guardian, you get to name who the personal representative is. You can create a list, if not this person, then this person, then this person, and you print it out. You take 2 people to witness it, and if you want, you can get it notarized to be even more official, and you're good, right? That's the basic level of a trust. You can also go to a lawyer to do this. This version that we have. You can put in your debts, put in your wasiyah, put in your heirs, and it'll calculate it. Now, if you have custom things that you want, obviously this free solution is not for you. Just call it TurboTax, right? TurboTax for Muslim will estate planning. That's kind of how we think about it. Okay? So this is the free version. Everybody shouldn't do it. If you'd like, you can text it now, or you can take a picture of this slide and do it when you get home. Okay? You keep it with you. Yeah. So this is just a document that you've kept. Now, what good is the will? You should probably tell the person that you're naming in there that, hey, look, if something happens to me, I put you in my will. And, oh, by the way, here's a copy of your will, of the will, just so that you have it. Now, I think you asked this question, or somebody asked this question before, which is, when you do this, it doesn't dictate, it doesn't actually list all of your assets. So this is a basic plan, right? So how does the person know about all your assets? They're not going to when you do this will, right? This is another reason why we recommend doing trusts and going through a lawyer and having a more sophisticated plan, is because if I have all these accounts and nobody knows what they are, well, then what good is this stuff, right? So another thing you could do on your own is you could create an Excel sheet or do something and have some sort of reference document, passwords as well is a big thing online, right? Like, so we have all these online accounts, right? What happens there? So at least have a, internal plan. But this is the kind of stuff we do when people come with us and do like actual custom plans. Then we, we make sure we have running lists and have all of their assets and all, that kind of thing, so that everything is accounted for. Correct. Yeah, we would put like bank account number, Chase bank account 2672, right? And we can put in there, as of the date of today, the value is $100. It might go up, it might go down, who knows, right? But at least it's identified, right?
So you go like the day of the death and see in the account whatever was, and then you just...
Well, we do it the day of planning, but you can keep a running, some people like to update this thing periodically. And so, every year, once a year, so on, you can update your asset list.
Okay, and what if you die when it's not updated?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, right? That's the whole point. When we do a trust, which we're going to talk about now, is you actually transfer ownership into the trust. It's not just about a list. So what you would do is we would create a deed in which we say, Yaser Ali transfers his house to the Ali Family Trust or the ABC Trust, right? And the trust becomes the owner legally on paper. Now you're the trustee, you still control it. Doesn't change the way you file your taxes, doesn't change anything from a tax perspective, but it becomes the owner. Your bank account, that Chase bank account that I just mentioned, we're actually going to transfer it into the trust. So the trust is going to become the owner of that account, right? The retirement account beneficiaries, we're going to retitle them. We're going to take the spouse off, we're going to put them in the trust. Right? So everything flows into the trust. Either while you're alive or upon your death, the trust becomes the beneficiary or the owner. So, but you don't lose any control. A lot of people get scared. Well, if I do a trust, what's going to happen? Do I have access to those things? Absolutely. You can take, add, subtract, remove, sell, buy, no problem. Okay? It depends on the scenario. It could be one trust for a couple. It can be a joint trust. It could be separate trusts. Depending upon how you want to own your assets. So some people like to have everything separate, right? We have separate accounts. We keep everything clean. We have one for her, one for him. So we could do two trusts. We could do some things are separate and some things are joint. So you can have a his, hers, ours version. Or you can just dump it all in there and everything's 50-50. We don't really keep track of who earns what. That's fine too. You can designate and allocate that. Yeah, that's the beauty of it, is you can say, look, this, this bank account is hers, and this bank account is ours, and this bank account is his. And so when we do distributions, we're only accounting for, if I die and something belongs to my wife, it still stays 100% hers. So in that scenario where we have, joint spouses, I mean, both people working, sometimes we'll do that scenario. Sometimes, like I said, we'll have separate trusts, and that might be in second marriages, for example. Somebody's remarried, they're really strict on keeping their things separate because they want to make sure their kids from a previous marriage and so on are taken care of. So in that scenario, we can do multiple trusts. It just depends on the family. Everything. So if a woman has $50,000 of jewelry, we want to identify that in there, right? At least, like I said, we'll put jewelry and we'll put an estimated value on the day we set this up. Maybe she gets more tomorrow, maybe she sells it, whatever. But that's why periodically you update this thing. Now, we don't physically transfer title, but we do identify it. Anything that has any significant value, we're going to put it in there. Correct. Anything you can do. So that's the beauty of the trust is you can say that. From an Islamic law perspective, the trustee's job is going. You can have these specific distributions. So mom wants to give, upon her death, she wants to give. There are two ways she can do it while she's alive. Then we don't talk about it anymore. Assume she wants to do it on her death. She can say in the trust, I want my jewelry to go to my daughter, right? And the trustee, now the job of the trustee is to account for that sort of $50,000 distribution, look at the sum, takes a $50,000 off from something else and do the accounting. No, that's not coming from the 1/3. That's coming from the mandatory shares. So from the inheritance, because it's the daughter. So we're just gonna discount from somewhere else. So it doesn't have to be equal shares of every asset. Say you have 3 homes, right? You might give 1 to 1, 1 to 1, 1 to 1. You know, if they're equal shares, you don't have to cut them all up and give a portion of every asset to each of the heirs. It's totally out, but it needs to be written. We don't want to. This happens all the time. I have an account. There's $100 in there. It's in my name, and I'm actually holding it for my brother overseas, right? It's very common. Well, my kids don't know that, right? I die, they're going to say, give it to me. It's mine, right? It's my inheritance. So if you have something that you own for somebody else that's in your name, that needs to be in your trust that says that account, that $100, even though it's in my name, it doesn't count in this process. It's a distribution that needs to go to so-and-so, and it doesn't count against the 1/3, and it doesn't count against the taraka, the part that's left, because it's, even though it has my name on it, it's technically not mine. So the beauty, again, is that you can carve out all of these things in here without having to try to explain it to a judge. Yes, uncle?
We have created multiple trusts.
Yes.
It must be
Sure.
different amounts, even this one also.
Yeah.
And one of the logic of creating those trusts was that something happens, some accident happened, somebody sued the sender.
Right.
The sender is protected.
Correct.
Is this the case if you have a house in a trust, if somebody falls, breaks a leg in the suit, is the trust going to play any role in it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'll just repeat the question for the recording. Is does this trust protect you from lawsuits? A lot of times people have this question. If I put everything in a trust, some people will come to me, I want to set up a trust because I want to protect myself from lawsuits. A lot of physicians, right, people in malpractice cases, like, I want to protect my assets. This kind of trust doesn't actually protect you. This is called a revocable trust. A revocable trust. What this trust is good for is it's good for avoiding the court system and privatizing your affairs. So avoiding probate and distributing your assets. Because you still have 100% control over it. Remember I said you can buy, you can sell, you can add, you can subtract. So what that does is it makes administration easy, but it's not a separate tax-paying entity. There's no tax return for this thing. And because it's not a separate entity, it's kind of an invisible wrapper, it doesn't give you that level of protection. There are other kinds of trusts, known as irrevocable trusts, which will give you that level of protection. Similar to LLCs, right? You have a rental property, you put it in an LLC, and what happens in sort of the corporate, you create a corporate veil around it so that the person can only sue the company. If they sue the company, their best case scenario, your worst case scenario, is that they can only take the assets in the company. So that rental property, for example, there's insurance, it gets paid, somebody slips, falls, injures, breaks, whatever, they sue and they win, then they take that property. They can't take your home and everything else, just what's inside of that LLC. What's inside of that irrevocable trust can work the same way. So it's a different type of trust that we would use for protection. Right now, what I'm talking about is a living trust. It's also known as a family trust. It's also known as a revocable trust. There's a few different names for it. Revocable or revocable are different pronunciations of the same thing. You can still put it in the trust. Yeah, so the trust can own the LLC, which owns the property. So you can have multiple layers of protection. The LLC will give you the protection from the lawsuits, and the trust will give you the protection from the probate and the sort of on-death planning.
If that happens, the heirs to get.
They'll get it all, sharia, everything. Exactly, yeah, yes, yes.
Tax advantages
For?
in
Okay, good. So I'm answer that question in a second. Was there a question here too? No? Okay, tax advantage. So the trust clarifies who owns what. This is very critical for Islamic inheritance perspective. Is there a tax advantage to a trust? We didn't talk about tax at all yet, right? We haven't mentioned one bit about tax. So there are two kinds of taxes. There is estate tax and there is income tax. Estate tax, by and large, doesn't really matter to most people because the current exemption is if you have less than $22.4 million as a married couple, 22.4 I think is 22 point something, you pay 0 in estate tax. That's death tax, tax on death. Okay? So we'll call it roughly rounded up to 23 million. Married couple has $23 million, has $20 million, there's no tax on death. Above 22.4 or 23 million, it's a 40% tax. Very steep. Okay? But what percentage of the population has more than $23 million? A really small percent. I was doing a presentation in San Francisco for a group of lawyers. Now, nationwide, it's like 0.0 something percent of people that have more than $23 million. And so I didn't spend much time on tax. And afterwards, the feedback was like, you missed the point here. And they said the percentage of people in San Francisco that are estate tax eligible is higher than any city in the United States, right? And so in certain pockets, this stuff matters, right? Estate tax. And you have to do all kinds of different planning to avoid that tax. But in most cases, it doesn't matter. You still have income tax. So if somebody dies, for example, you have a retirement account. That's pre-tax money. Somebody has to pay that tax on death. I mean, when they inherit it, somebody has to pay tax unless it goes to charity. If it goes to a nonprofit, then there's no charity. So when we talk about setting this stuff up with a lawyer and doing this type of strategy, we're talking about that kind of planning for tax strategy for retirement accounts. What happens when somebody inherits a property? California is a great example. You've held a house for 20, 30 years, right? And the property's gone up 5x in some cases, if not more, right? People that bought properties in the 70s here, 80s. How do we ensure that we get a step up in basis? How do we ensure that there's not a property tax reappraisal, right? So all of these things come into play when we're thinking about tax planning. It's not that the trust itself gives you an advantage, but it's the sitting down and the strategy time that we do that we can plan, accordingly. Like, for example, somebody says, I want to give 10% to charity. You can give that 10% from your cash, or you can give it from a retirement account, and which one's smarter, and how do we do it? Those kinds of questions come into play. Typically, how much does it cost? Typically, I would say somewhere between $3,000 to $5,000 or $2,000 to $5,000. That's your ballpark of, if you go to lawyers, that's what you're going to pay. There's more work involved. It takes more time. There's more transfers. This is what happens. Now, some of your employers actually cover these. There's a new trend in legal insurance in a lot of large employers, a lot of tech companies. They'll give you a perk. You might have to pay a few dollars to sign up for it, but different employers have different plans, and some of them will cover a trust for you. At least a will for you, but in some cases a trust as well. So you might want to check with your companies as well whether you have a legal benefit for in a trust that is either discounted or sometimes free altogether. So you'll want to check that, and those are plans that we can work with as well. Yeah. Correct. 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 You can specify as long as both spouses are in agreement. You can't come in and tell me that's all mine, right? That doesn't work, right? So if you want to change the default assumptions, anytime we do estate planning, period, we got to have both husband and wife. You can absolutely put kids in trust. You can gift, assets to the kids while you're alive, and you can also name them as beneficiaries. Absolutely. So just to close out, inshallah, then we'll take questions because I know it's getting late. So additional benefits, business succession planning. You own a business, right? 80% of businesses in America are family-owned. What percentage goes to the next generation, survives the death of the founder? Right? They say like less than 40, I think. And then third generation is like single digits, right? Think about the successful families in American society, the Waltons and the all these big famous families, they're very good at family succession. That's how, dynasties emerge. Now, interestingly, Ibn Khaldun, he has a analysis, a very famous Muslim scholar. So he's written this, sort of the Muqaddimah, which is like his commentary on sociology, and he writes that basically wealth only lasts 3 generations. In dynasties, the first generation works really hard, the second generation takes, and still has saw what the first generation did. Meaning, and this applies like to immigrants and stuff. It's amazing. The second, and he's looking at Bedouin desert people, but the same thing applies. Second generation sees the work that their parents put in, the hard work, so they still have a little bit of work ethic, and that they're still building and they're still contributing. The third generation never saw a day of hardship in their life. They're just accustomed to opulence, and what happens is by that third generation, the wealth is squandered. Pretty fascinating. SubhanAllah. I wrote this so long ago, and it's true. And so when we think about trust planning, like I said, it's not just about who gets what. It's also about, can we do it intelligently to prevent that type of destruction of a generation by spoiling them, right? So this is where trusts are very valuable, is you can say, look, they're only going to get us, it's their wealth, but we can structure it so that they don't waste all of the money. Charitable planning, we talked about this. Asset protection is a question Uncle asked before. So a will versus a trust, I'm going to skip over this, but basically the gist of this, and I'll let you take some questions. The gist of this is that when do we recommend a trust? What's the threshold for a trust versus a will, right? So we say if you have a few $100,000 of savings, a trust is going to be better, right? Because the cost of probate, the money that your kids are going to inherit, the preventing of family harmony, the more wealth you have, the more important it is for you to set up a trust, right? Now you have minor children. That's also a reason to have a trust, because you don't want to have a court proceeding over the wealth that your children are going to inherit. So you might solve the guardianship problem in the will, but you're still going to have the trustee problem about who manages their wealth and so on and so forth. So to close, we have, remember, you can text this number and get your free will. Just to talk about a little bit about next steps. My goal in doing this is twofold. One is to create an education, right? To share with you the responsibility that we have as Muslims. The Prophet ﷺ said, as I mentioned at the outset, تَعَلَّمُوا الْفَرَائِض وَعَلِّمُوا فَإِنَّهُ نِصْفُ الْعِلْمِ. Learn and teach inheritance, for verily it's half of all knowledge. So the hope is, inshallah, that we're able to do that. The second thing is that we want to implement that which we learned. So at a minimum, I'd like that you all do the free will, right? You go home, it takes you 5 minutes, you fill out the form, you go do that. But the reality is that most of you probably need more than that free will, right? That's the reality. And so my encouragement would be that you create a trust or an estate plan to fulfill your religious obligations and achieve a lot of what we've talked about today. Whether that's with somebody you already know or a lawyer that you trust or whatnot, or if we have the opportunity, I'd love to be able to help you as well. What we're offering is tomorrow, I think most of the slots are filled, but tomorrow we will have free 30-minute appointments for people that would like to, that are considering setting up a trust, right? That don't want to do the free will, but they want to do something more. They have complexity with respect to assets or financials or family situation, so on and so forth. So the way you can do that is also actually if you text this link, this number, you'll get a link in your email and you can sign up for a slot if it's still available. That consult is totally free. Normally we charge for the consult, but that consult is totally free. And if the slots tomorrow are full, the slots are 30 minutes here. So it's just a way to start the conversation, to get some understanding, understand fees, what your situation entails. Then we can have that conversation via phone or video conference. I'm flying back to Phoenix tomorrow, but we can have that remote conversation very easily, inshallah. So you can email me or text either of those numbers, in fact, and set that up if tomorrow doesn't work. But ideally, like I said, we would like to try and facilitate as much of this as possible for the masajid and the board members and those that are active in the masjid. The encouragement is to ask people to leave a wasiyah expressly in your will, in your trust, for the masjid, so that it's a way to build an endowment so that this place 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now is self-sustaining, and that we can move away from the model of perpetual fundraising, right? So that we have, sustainable institution. I mean, it's good to be charitable, but we can't do that forever, right? So if we can build endowments, fund them, invest that money, and the profit from that money goes to cover the operations of the masjid. I mean, that's the beauty. That's how Islamic institutions existed and do exist to this day. If you go to Turkey, you go to Egypt, you go to different parts of the world, this is what they are. They're working off of endowments, of awqaf, of a waqf, right? That's what we want to do for our institutions as well. So I'll formally close with that, and I'll take questions, inshallah. If you have to leave, I know it's getting late. You can do so. And again, if you want to check whether there are slots available, the easiest way to do that is either stick around and we can look, or you can text this number and we will do that. Oh, you have to check with your HR on that. Yeah, yeah. If you know your which provider and things like that, we can talk about that. Yeah. Are they? Okay. They're not sold out technically because they're free. Okay. Phone or video? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm in Phoenix. So we can do it all. We can do that all remotely, inshallah. Please. Sure. Great question. So we get this question all the time, right? Natural tendency of people is to say, look, I want to make sure that, my daughter's taken care of. And my concern is that if she gets less, it's not going to be enough for her. So can we use the wasiyah as one way to reach that result? The problem with that idea, although it's a good one, is that it's expressly not allowed. Expressly. So the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is that you can leave a wasiyah, la wasiyyata li warithin, except that you can't leave a wasiyah for somebody who's already a warith. So the daughter in that scenario is already a warith, right? She's already inheriting. So particularly for that reason, which is to enhance the share of one or the other, it's not allowed. Now the best solution there is hiba, is gifting. So we do a lot of gifting when we talk about structuring. Because this question is one, particularly in this society. I mean, this comes up. My son is a neurosurgeon. My daughter is a divorced, stay-at-home mom.
Or one of the child is very poor, you want to give that.
For sure. So what we say in that scenario is lifetime gifting. Lifetime gifting. Don't wait till your death, right? Don't wait till your death. So, I mean, because the reality is the rules are the rules. They're from the Qur'an, right? And they're still applicable. So what do we do to apply the rule, be true to the instruction, while at the same time recognizing the sort of challenges or whatnot of the society, right? So hiba is going to be your solution in this scenario. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Correct. You can do these. You can do all kinds of things. This is also part of the beauty of the trust, is that as long as it's a present gift. So in other words, I can set aside that money for future college fund while I'm alive, so that it's their college fund. Assuming I have it, right? Assuming I have it, I can set up in the trust or that, because not only that, let's say there's age disparities, right? So it's almost impossible to be equal. You have a 20-year-old, right? Or let's say you have a 25-year-old and you have a 15-year-old. You paid for college and marriage for one. I mean, you spent $100,000 more for the older child versus the younger child, right? Now what? Now what? And they're both boys, right? Do we account for that? What's the fairness component there? Maybe one kid went to public school, one kid went to private school, right? I mean, there's all kinds of different scenarios. The point is, the rules are the rules. There's a lot of flexibility while you're alive to do these things, but this is really where the counseling comes in. Like, this is the work that we do. Is sit down with you, understand what your family dynamics are, And how do we design something that is religiously fulfilling your obligation while recognizing that, hey, look, I spent $200,000 on child number 1 to become a doctor, and number 2 went for free, and now they're doing something else. How do I account for that? Current gifts. Yeah, so you can set it while you're alive as a future distribution, but a current gift. So a little bit of nuance. Correct. You would have to have it in the present, yeah. So you can say in there that I want my college, I want to fund education for my kids, and the trustee is responsible for doing those things, absolutely. The other thing to remember is as long as one spouse is alive, they're going to have a level of, they're generally going to be the trustee. Generally, right? They're going to be the trustee. Not 100% of situations, but generally they're going to be the trustee. So they're going to have a little bit of discretion in these matters. Consistent with what we've written, like they don't have unlimited discretion. If 100% goes to the spouse, they do whatever they want. But there's going to be a discretion that they have with respect to how to spend on each child. Inside of the trust, for example. They're the trustee, the shares are laid out. Now they want to make sure, we put in there, make sure education is accounted for, make sure this is accounted for, make sure this is accounted for. Insurance comes in on death. Insurance comes in on death. It's insurance proceeds that will go into the trust. Then when side. Thank you. Jazakallah khair. Barakallah feek. The trust will then have the ability to allocate accordingly. Other questions? Anything else? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's a good question. Do you need 2 wills or 1 will? You need 2 wills. Absolutely, 2 wills. 1 will is not enough. You got to have 2. If you're married, you got to have 2 wills. You might have 1 trust, but you can't have 1 will. It's per person. Actually, all of the documents on that page beside the trust are 1 per person. The power of attorney, the healthcare directives, each of those have to be 1 per person. Because when I said the will is not very effective, it is effective if both spouses die. Then for sure it's very effective. Right?
So if one person dies, we're going to go to the property.
It's just all going to go to the survivor.
And hopefully, if we don't do a trust,
Yeah.
hopefully the survivor
We'll take care of things. Right.
If we die, then everything goes to the state.
It doesn't go to the state, but the state is going to be supervising the transfer process. That's what probate is. It doesn't go to the state. A lot of times people say, it's really good for business. People are like, I came here because I got to set up something because the state's going to take everything. They're not going to take everything, right? They're not going to take everything, but it's going to be inefficient. It's going to be inefficient. Time, and money. Really, it's time and money. Yeah, things are frozen for a period of time. It's difficult to take stuff out. You got to pay the court. You got to pay the lawyers. You got to pay time and money. There's fees. Yeah, there's different stuff. Yeah, and California is expensive for everything. So. Still have to go through the probate process. Yeah, that's exactly the scenario where the trust is more advantageous. Both parents died. They named, brother-in-law. Everything goes to brother-in-law. Brother-in-law can step right in, go to the bank, take over. He's technically now not the owner. He's the trustee, so he's managing everything for the benefit of the children and his parents, her parents, all the different warithin that we talked about. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So that's a great question. So medical debt is like the largest thing that drives people into bankruptcy today. That question was asked to one of the mashayikh, and they said that they have to look into that a little bit because it's so insurmountable, like it's a mountain of debt, right? Like it just erases everything. And so if it's debts that you can control and you have the ability to pay off and such, you should certainly, take care of those things. But in certain cases, there may be debts that are just outside of your control, most notably the healthcare costs. So Allah alam, I haven't heard, like I said, if somebody has the ability to pay, they should pay. Now, of course, a lot of that stuff is negotiable. You might have a debt of $1 million that you can settle for a percentage of that, and so on and so forth. That's the kind of work that somebody would, try to do, is try to settle debts, not necessarily at the full amount, but wallahu alam.
So the inheritor, the heirs will have to pay.
Yeah, so that's I'm not sure. It's a
No,
religiously no. Religiously, heirs don't take on the debt obligations of the decedent.
Oh, I thought the death is
You have to write it. Some certain debts, like I said, you can inherit a mortgage. But let's say I owe you $10, and I pass away, and I didn't tell my children, or I didn't write that I owe you $10. You can't go after my kids for that $10. We're talking about two different sets of laws here, right? So from an Islamic perspective, I should have written it down because it's my responsibility. Now, if my family decides voluntarily to step up and give you the $10, that's alhamdulillah. But there's a chance that if they could say, we don't care about your $10, now the person is sinful because they didn't fulfill your debt. So it's a big problem. Right? So again, it all comes down to writing. It's very important to write these things down. Okay? So inshallah, we'll close with that. Like I said, I'm looking at this calendar. There are a couple spots, it looks like, still available. So you can talk to me about those, inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to understand and implement that which we heard. Wa akhiru da'wana.